All right. Good afternoon. Welcome back. Let's go ahead and get started for today. So today is the part 2 on topics related to culture and race in health and science communication. So we'll pick back up where we left off in talking about cultural conceptions of health. And we'll also take some time to address the Krebs article that I'm asking you to read for this week that gets into issues of health disparities in greater detail. I've talked to a few folks who are working on the annotated bibliography and making some progress there. And I just wanted to address a couple questions that came up to help you to prepare for that. The first question was regarding whether or not you need to choose the same or similar topic to the content of your disparities presentation that you'll do in week 6. And that's up to you. So if you decide, for instance, that for your annotated bibliography, that you're really interested in issues related to alcohol consumption in teenagers and health campaigns related to alcohol in teenagers. You could choose to focus on that for your annotated bibliography, and then also, so you can do that, or you can go completely different directions if there's 2 different topics that interest you that you'd like to explore. One way of thinking about the difference between these 2 assignments, right, is that the annotated bibliography is more asking you to look at articles in health or science communication that address or deal with the topic. So for instance, you might look at things like health campaigns or initiatives or efforts that have been meant to address teenage alcohol consumption. Or you might, for instance, look at patient-provider interpersonal communication with teenagers on the topic. So you really want to make sure it's focused to communication in that way. But for the presentation, I'm asking you to really focus on this idea of a health disparity, right? The idea that there is a specific population that's targeted or disproportionately impacted by a health issue. So as we'll talk about for today, for instance, African Americans are disproportionately at greater risk of conditions such as cancer in large part due to socioeconomic conditions and disparities in not receiving as quality of healthcare, right? And that would be an example of a disparity we could address. Or HIV/AIDS and its impact on LGBTQ community are some examples of a particular population being disproportionately impacted by an issue. So that would be the difference for that presentation. Also, for that annotated bibliography, you can be sort of as general or specific as makes sense. I think choosing a topic or issue that interests you, for instance, health literacy impacting Asian American and Pacific Islanders would be an example of an area to focus on. And so based on the articles that you see or come up with, you can use that to indicate how focused or specific you'd like to be. I've had some folks who have sent me some initial articles that asked if they're on the right track. You're welcome to do that if you're working through it and just want a second opinion there. I'm available for office hours, email, or through an appointment as you're working through on this assignment. Just remember that that annotated bibliography is due on Sunday. So what I want you to do in preparation for thinking about this and then the presentation later on in the term, I asked you to take some time after Monday's class to think about May 2nd and May 4th and whether or not you will be absent for either or both of those dates. I'd like you to take some time to write or type and then turn in to me at the end of class. If you have any presentation restrictions for either of those dates, and if you don't, and you can make both of them, if there's a time that you'd prefer to present. So we have about 14 people, so we would go 7 and 7 between those 2 days and have some people present on that Monday 2nd, other people present on Wednesday the 4th, And so I just want to make sure that you're able to present on the date that works within your schedule. Once you've done that and indicated your restrictions or preference, I'd like you to take some time to jot down some of the ideas that you're thinking about for your annotated bibliography. What are the questions or issues that are interesting to you, maybe in thinking about our discussion so far in the class on health and science? And what has been some initial work that you have done or you're planning to do to explore this in a little bit more detail? And then regarding either the annotated bibliography by the end of this week or the presentation at the end of week 6, do you have any remaining questions or things that you would like to have addressed in class? And if so, you're welcome to jot those questions down and ask them in just a minute. So I'll give you a little bit of time to work on that. Once you've wrapped this up, what I'd like you to do is to find a partner in the class to talk to just to share the ideas or things that you're thinking about so far for this annotated bib. You could also form a group of 3 if you'd like, just to share what ideas are coming together and maybe to share any things that stand out to you among what your partner has shared or things you'd like to add in thinking through their ideas. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, that's a really good one. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to explore that. You know, you could also look at like messaging and campaign related to that too. I think one challenge with that topic, right, is that it's for this class less about like what physically happens, more about like the way the initiative and campaign communication related to that topic. Yeah. So as long as you're looking at it, like maybe looking at how organizations should be built, it's a little bit technologies. About 2 or 3 more minutes to share your ideas. Yeah. Yeah. The presentations, yeah. I think that if it's focused on things and focused on disparities on that, I think that's fine. Like you don't need to focus on a specific library. Great. Yeah, but it's yeah, that would be a really big yeah, of course. So it looks like most of the groups are about wrapped up. So in kind of hovering around and hearing what you all are thinking about and working on, honestly, I've got to say I'm really excited. It sounds like you all are picking some really interesting and thoughtful topics. A lot of people are choosing topics that are really maybe relevant to what they're interested in studying or looking at or already doing in their lives, which is awesome. You know, my only Note of caution for the annotated bibliography is just to make sure that you're connecting that topic to communication, right? So an easy way to do that is to look up your topic or issue. For instance, the war on drugs, issues related to access to insulin, and make sure to kind of do that search within health or science communication related journals. Again, some of the ways you can explore that are about patient-provider relationships, maybe about health campaigns, maybe about how health information is communicated, maybe about health teams and information, or maybe studies that have analyzed particular populations related to the issues that you've identified, right? The idea here being that maybe it's an interview study with people that have been impacted by skyrocketing insulin prices or something similar. So as long as you're really tying it back to communication and to work in communication, I think that these topics are really good to explore. So if you're running into a bit of an issue or you're not sure how closely connected to communication you're finding your sources so far, you're welcome to work with me on that as well. For instance, things to think about might be as you're preparing for a presentation, an issue that does not necessarily biologically impact somebody more than another person, but is nevertheless experienced differently. For instance, infant mortality rate among people of color, right, is an example of how disparities might emerge in healthcare. So some really good examples of topics you all are coming up with. Again, I'm excited to see these in action. And if you find that you don't want to explore this for your presentation, that's fine. You're welcome to shift gears. But if you are, it helps you have a little bit of a foundation to draw on for that presentation too. So given that and some of that initial work, I want to do a quick recap of last class and dive into the new stuff for today. Since I know that you have sort of the annotated bibliography coming up, we'll get done a little bit early today to give you some extra time to work on and develop that. So we spent some time last class discussing that presentation assignment and what I'm looking for there. We also started to talk about the issue of diversity in healthcare. For instance, the ways that we can modify our communication and approach in thinking about health in a variety of ways, like people with disabilities, communicating to children or communicating to elderly patients, and also the idea that different cultures have different attitudes surrounding care. We had this story, right, of Carl who doesn't want to get regular testing for cancer, even though he comes from a high-risk household. So one thing we talked about last class was blank, or the conviction that what is familiar or is more right or moral than the alternatives. What is the blank here? Yeah. Yes. So ethnocentrism refers to the belief that one's own culture or beliefs are better than another. Patients and providers could have this, and that could impact the interactions that they have with each other. The provider thinks that their approach to medicine and health is the only way to go. It's not really creating a dialogue with patients or considering the cultural needs of their patients. So being considerate of ethnocentrism and trying to unlearn ethnocentrism is an ongoing task that we have to do as we're thinking about these issues. Ethnocentrism might also explain some of the disparities in care that you all start to identify as you prepare for the project as well. For instance, ethnocentrism might mean that there is one way that a health issue has been messaged, like cancer. And maybe that way of messaging or talking about care doesn't necessarily reach the same populations equally and disproportionately benefits some who have greater trust in the use of screenings for care or have greater access to digital information about that issue. So for today, we'll explore and define culture a little bit more, explaining sort of the cultural conceptions of health and illness, and also thinking about, as we go into the CREPS piece, disparities as they relate to care. So there's a good chance that either in a class in communication or a class outside of communication that you have had a discussion about culture before, right? Culture generally comes up in just about every class that you take because culture is crucially important and impacts how we think about a whole variety of different topics. So while you might hear the term culture before and feel like you have it down, I think it's still useful to refresh and think about how it plays into health and science related issues, right? Culture is a set of beliefs, rules, and practices that people in a group share. One example of this might include things like nationality. That's something that's oftentimes discussed as an element of culture. And certainly nationality is important and is a way that cultural identity might be expressed in practice. An example of this is this idea of Ukrainian identity and the sort of depictions of Ukrainian civilians who have been impacted, of course, by this conflict. Also, you might think about beliefs and traditions. So if you're a member of a club, a group, or organization, there's a good chance that that group has a history, a shared set of practices or beliefs or actions that they do. Again, I did speech and debate, and we had a tradition of passing down vocal warm-ups to get us prepared for a tournament that oftentimes came from people who had since graduated. My old coach actually sends me videos of our team doing a warm-up from when I was working with them that I find kind of sweet. It is an example of passing down traditions and so on. It can tie, of course, to ethnicity and sort of a background, although, of course, ethnicity might be very different and expressed differently depending on people. And culture also ties itself to ideas of diversity, right? So we oftentimes find ourselves as members of culture in a chosen capacity in the groups and networks that we choose to make. And we might find sort of by circumstance, lottery of birth, that we are sort of fitting within culture in terms of our own identity, family background, and so on, right? That culture brings in a set of experiences and assumptions that shape who we are today and how we look at the world, right? Standpoint theory is the idea that who we are comes from a position, right? How we look at or view an issue is based on the experience we had growing up, the connections we formed with other people, and ultimately our attitude on life. That's, of course, relevant to health and science issues because, for instance, a lot of Indigenous and Native American approaches to medicine view a very kind of holistic approach and might be more skeptical to medical interventions that don't necessarily consider a combination of factors that make up overall health, right? A lot of Western approaches to medicine generally tend to prioritize use of medical treatments and interventions and are very kind of physical body approach oriented. And so those assumptions about what it means to be healthy are very closely tied to culture. You can think back to an example on the first day of class when we talked about deaf cultures and deaf identity, the idea that for people who are deaf, they might or might not choose cochlear implants on the basis of how they want themselves to be and what their sense of health or well-being are, whether or not that includes continuing to be deaf. So as mentioned, right, not to form too much of a binary in thinking about these approaches, but there are distinctions in some of the Eastern and Western traditions related to health in science. Historically, kind of thinking back over the course of centuries, scientists and experts surrounding health and related issues, generally speaking, Eastern perspectives tended to be more focused on the kind of balance and rhythms of the body, that the idea of a body as being harmonious and connected and sort of in sync with itself was a really big element of how health was being perceived. That health was sort of viewed under this combination of factors and well-being, and that oftentimes really considered the idea that if somebody is unhealthy, that the cause of that might be internal factors related to their well-being. Meanwhile, the Western approach generally focused on a scientific model of care that treated the sort of body as prone to invaders from the outside, right? So one way of thinking about this is about thinking about certain illness, again, thinking about cancer or heart disease as an invader, right? Somebody that has come in or something that has come in your body and your blood cells are trying to attack it or to take it down, right? For instance, the way we talk about the immune system as sort of like our fighters and trying to keep ourselves healthy uses that type of framing as well. It's interesting that this Western approach also parallels a more individualistic orientation, right? A lot of Western cultures tend to be more individualistic in approaching connection with other people and approaching foreign policy and other related issues, right? And they're much more concerned with this idea of managing property, keeping out intruders, and that approach sort of seeps into how we think about health. So the idea here is that different approaches to culture have thought about and defined health in very different ways. These perspectives, again, are really useful for us to think about when we're engaging with a diversity of patients, perspectives, and experiences. One of them being the organic perspective, and this goes back over several centuries, that oftentimes under the organic perspective, for somebody to be sick or unwell, it had to be seen. Somebody had to have an injury or a physical mark that they were not doing well. For instance, the plague or examples of leprosy were cases in which the physical indicators of sickness were a marker of somebody's health and well-being. There's this idea of evidence-based medicine, right? The evidence-based approach is more trying to make decisions on treatments based on studies. So somebody conducts a blood test, for instance, and determines, hey, your iron levels are really low. You need to take this iron supplement regularly in order to improve this issue. And then lastly, there's a harmony perspective drawing from a sort of Eastern tradition that health is this overall sense of well-being. Again, it comes from the idea of yin and yang, representing different halves or polar opposites related to the body. That there is a calm yin side or an expressive yang side, right? That they're contrasted in these different halves of somebody. And qi refers to this overall life energy or being that comes through the combination of these factors. That we need both of those halves in order to have overall health and well-being. We have to have ups and downs in life, in health, in sort of our overall identity. And that approach to thinking about health has shaped a lot of Eastern approaches to medicine. So as we think about that, right, if we think back to the Carl scenario that we talked about on Monday, we were talking about how for Carl, he felt like going to see a doctor just made you sicker because suddenly you go in and the doctor tells you you have this, this, and this. Or maybe we tend to view a hospital as an unsafe environment. We worry about contracting something or getting something or feeling sick because we go in. Or maybe we feel like we were just fine. We correlate a doctor giving us a diagnosis with that doctor causing us to be sick, right? So our assumptions about care based on culture can mean that we interpret and use narratives and storytelling about our health experiences in a really different way, right? So if you think, for instance, about supernatural causes, those were oftentimes used in the past to describe and explain experiences of health. There's this evil spirit that has invaded the body, and therefore somebody is unhealthy. We sort of make sense of our experiences using storytelling and narratives. For instance, a more Western perspective on something like a cancer diagnosis might say, I'm being invaded by an intruder. There is this outside thing that is coming in, and we need to fight it, right? The use of war metaphors, fighting, beating the battle are oftentimes used in talking about conditions such as cancer. Meanwhile, my body is in distress might be more of an Eastern perspective, right? Less viewing the body as an intruder or invader, and more viewing the idea that a body is out of whack or not fully in harmony or in that close relationship with itself. So those contrasting approaches can be used to understand how we think about culture as it relates to the narratives that we tell ourselves about our health. So if you were like me in high school, you read the Nathaniel Hawthorne book, The Scarlet Letter. The Scarlet Letter is Puritan era set in that time, right? And the premise of the book is that the main character, Hester, has committed adultery. The idea is that in this very conservative Puritan society, as a result of having committed adultery, she has to wear a gigantic letter A on her clothing. And she has to walk around town wearing the letter A to symbolize to everybody that she has committed adultery, and therefore, as sort of associated with that, she should be a cause of shame, that people see her and they think, oh, you have the A, you're not trustworthy, right? That's an example of stigma, a visual indicator of somebody's lack of well-being or trustworthiness. And scholars in health communication and science communication have identified stigma as by far one of the greatest barriers to receiving quality care and support. In fact, I specialize in studying stigma and related areas between stigma and communication because stigma is such a significant factor on how we tend to view health and think about what it means to be healthy and so on. It's one thing to have incredible medical care and support, but if somebody is not able to access that or doesn't feel like they deserve to access that, then they can't take advantage of that. And that can be a major cause of health disparities as well. So stigma, which comes from a Greek term, Greek origins, thinking about stigmata, right, and the usage of a physical indicator related to social ostracization, refers to the idea that there is social rejection that makes the person that is stigmatized or has a stigma be seen as dishonorable, as worthy of ignoring, as not worthy of care. Again, if you think about conditions historically, thinking about the plague, thinking about leprosy, what would one do if they saw somebody that was clearly showing signs of or had the plague, right? They would probably try to create as much distance as they could from that person, avoid that person as much as possible, and so on. Maybe that's out of a fear of catching or of contagiousness, but even in situations in which stigmatized illness or condition is visually seen as not contagious, people can oftentimes still create distance. Again, HIV/AIDS is one example of this. Knowing some of the ways that it's passed, sometimes people will like avoid or not spend time with somebody on that basis, even though there's no way that they would transmit the disease in the air, right? The idea being that stigma is so strong that sometimes it draws people away, even though they're not actually at risk, right? There's actually some interesting work. The late Dr. Dan Brower does a lot of really cool study related to stigma as it relates to HIV/AIDS communities. In fact, did an article about self-stigmatization and interviewed people who were HIV positive who had an HIV positive tattoo on their arms. And whenever they were engaged, for instance, in sexual activity with a partner, the tattoo would be visible and they would use that to initiate a conversation about risk and about care associated with being HIV positive. So the idea of intentionally stigmatizing somebody, having a visual mark to indicate or start a conversation was an example of some of the ways that stigma might be challenged or responded to. If you think back, of course, to World War II and Nazi Germany, right? That's another example of the use of stigma, the use of symbols, right, to indicate somebody's social identity or status, and of course, an incredibly harmful example of stigma as well. In this way, then, stigma, whether it's a visual sign of a disease or illness or a sign of identity, right, or a set of assumptions that we bring to a person, can be a really major issue that can actually be a greater threat to somebody's health than an actual condition that they might suffer. For instance, stigma can bring with it social isolation. That is, somebody comes out and shares that they're HIV positive, and they have family members or friends who suddenly stop talking to them or spending time with them. Of course, social isolation can be incredibly psychologically damaging. It leads to things such as self-harm, lack of self-esteem, and lack of support. Another thing that emerges, right, is internalization, where somebody blaming themselves for their stigmatized status. The idea that it's their fault, or that they, because a stigmatized image has been projected onto them, that they are somehow worse, is an example of that. A lack of care, right? So sometimes providers are less willing or less fully able to provide care on the basis of what they see as a stigmatized marker or indicator, right? For instance, we could think back to our discussion about age and say, well, you're an older patient. You don't have as long to live, therefore you're going to receive less care, would be an example of stigma at play. And also less desire to receive care. Studies suggest that people who experience stigma might be less motivated or interested in seeking out care that could support them. Again, because of the sort of social impacts and assumptions that come with thinking about care and relief, right? One example of thinking about this is sort of ongoing discussion related to body image, weight, and so on, right? Somebody might be stigmatized on the basis of their weight, and as a result of being heavier, right, might be seen as sort of socially ostracized and less likely to receive support, right? There might be, depending on the situation or condition, genuine health issues or concerns that might come up in somebody's life, but it's a question of how we as people make a value judgment on somebody's well-being and whether or not they're a good or a bad person that makes up the experience of stigma. So I'm going to have you all take some time to address another scenario in a couple of groups. Fred has recently been diagnosed with HIV, and I want you to discuss a little bit as a group. First of all, what might reduce Fred's experience of stigma, thinking about sort of efforts to address stigma. And then lastly, how might there be some differences between Eastern or Western approaches in identifying and supporting Fred's health? So we'll do two teams for this one. So we've got 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 12. So we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 on this side. We'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on this side. Take some time to talk a little bit about this prompt. I'll ask each of the two groups to share, and we'll talk about that together in just a little bit. Think about 1 or 2 more minutes. It sounds like most groups are wrapping up here. All right, so it sounds like the 2 groups are about done. So let's chat a little bit about this, starting here on this side. What were the things that you all thought in regards to stigma and the different approaches to health? Right. That's really a smart approach because having community among people who experience stigma is found to consistently reduce some of the negative social impacts, also be a way that culture and identity is able to develop, and also educating, right, taking on that type of role. What about this second part here about Eastern and Western? Right. I think those are good things to think about. We were thinking about the sort of approaches, right? Obviously, we live in a world now of a lot of advances in medicine and technology, and it's not to say that like Eastern approaches disregard scientific evidence or Western approaches disregard sort of the holistic approach, but that what we see is in many ways a combination of the two. So as you all pointed out, right, it might be important for Fred to receive sort of evidence-based treatment to know the stage that he's at and the care that he might need, but it's also important to think about things like his psychological and social well-being. It's one thing to get the hard evidence and information he needs about managing HIV, but it's another to understand how he can live a full and fulfilling life in that context. So that could be an example there. How about on this side?
And then finding a support group, whether it's online or in person, and just gives them like a safe space to talk about the issues that you might be experiencing, and then like, talk to other people about like their experiences, and then just help not feel so like alone. And then educating others, regardless of the people that he needs, and who needs to or chooses to disclose his HIV status. And then the people he's supposed to, like parents, friends, stuff like that, and just explaining to them what the diagnosis means, and just like educating them to try and break any stigma that goes there.
Yeah, thanks, Maisie. I think your group does a really great job here talking about this as well. One thing that we definitely see is the emergence of online networks as a major way that people who experience stigma or people who might have more rare conditions have networks and opportunities to connect with people similar to them. In fact, one thing that providers might do as part of their care is to put you in network or communication to somebody that is at a similar place to you or has received a similar diagnosis to you, such as a support group or even something like a mentorship network that allows people to work together. So I also like some of the ways you were talking about that sort of combination of approaches to think about health in terms of thinking about the need to holistically provide support too. So really good work here in sort of explaining and talking about how these different approaches help us to think about health and also in thinking about stigma, right? So there is an entire field in communication in areas related to health about stigma management communication that comes from Dr. Rebecca Meisenbach. One of the sort of things that she talks about are how efforts to manage or respond to stigma might include framing stigmatized things as strengths or as positive things. I'm glad this happened to me, or this thing you're saying is a bad thing, is a good thing. It's sort of like if somebody bullies you or calls you a silly name, like you turning that around and using that name for yourself in a positive way. Directly confronting people and so on are some of the strategies that people talk a little bit about. And one of the things that I've explored is this idea of intersectional stigma management communication, or the idea that when people are juggling multiple stigmas, for example, multiple diagnoses, or are kind of at the margins of multiple aspects of identity that are stigmatized, that they develop strategies to address more than one at the same time. So stigma is really kind of interesting area to keep exploring, and I think you all did a good job here of hitting on some key ideas there. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the ways that roles and our efforts to manage communication look. I swear the shifting gears wasn't intentional, but it might have been subliminal, I guess. So one way to think about this in terms of how different cultures think about and address issues of health differently is not just to think about how they treat or portray illness, but also how they see themselves within that, right? The idea here being that the role that we take on is sort of referring to our perspective, our behaviors, and whatever expectations that we might have as part of the group. a shaman or a health kind of professional figure who's in charge of managing the health needs of the tribe and group, right? The idea here being that we take on different roles, we tell stories about ourselves and who we are and how we experience issues. Another example might be the ways in which we refer to ourselves as either a victim or a survivor, right? A victim, for instance, of a drunk driving accident would be an example of using that narrative to frame issues of health. Saying that somebody is a survivor of cancer would be an example of how that narrative brings about cultural expectations that somebody worked hard, they fought, they did their best, and they are now a survivor of that. So that's one way to think about culture, right? Is to think about how different cultures treat the roles and perspectives of people in health differently. I mentioned before that the metaphor of a body as a machine gets used a lot in thinking about health and science-related issues, and it's an interesting one because you think about like your heart, your lungs, your stomach, all of the parts of your body working together, almost like being like cogs in a machine. And the mechanical and scientific perspective oftentimes uses that type of metaphor to describe the human body. For instance, somebody might say that they are malfunctioning or not optimal, and use similar metaphors like that to describe their well-being. And then lastly, when thinking about roles, one way that roles happen is to think about a paternalistic style, right? So a paternalistic role is one in which caregivers are framed as parents and patients are framed as children. Thinking back to our discussion last class, that use of parent-child to describe health interactions especially comes out if we're working with children or we're working with elderly patients or patients with disabilities, for instance. But it also emerges in thinking about issues of race and health disparities in other contexts too. For instance, disproportionately women report that they feel somewhat paternalized or not treated as fully autonomous or understanding of health issues in the same way. And people of color might also feel infantilized or treated in a way that's talked down to or not fully respected. And so the use of paternalism as a way of talking about or engaging in the patient-provider relationship is one example of how health disparities might emerge. Because when somebody is paternalizing or talking down, you're not getting as much information, you're not getting as quality of information, and you have less trust toward a provider. I mentioned that there are a variety of indigenous perspectives related to health. We explored some of those earlier in the term when we were talking about how sort of indigenous history plays into our current conceptions and understandings of health and medicine. One example of this are Native American shamans who exhibit sort of a healing style or type of healing and support for individuals. It might involve the use of medicine or herbs, or might involve the use of specific rituals in order to support the health of the individual or group. Faith healers are expected to sort of channel holy or some type of power related to health and medicine. And a common practice in a lot of Native American and indigenous groups is known as glossolalia, or a sort of trance-like state that health providers and healers might give that's associated with healing and well-being, right? The usage of similar things such as meditation, or even the way that terminology such as mindfulness has gained a lot of traction and attention, shows us that these approaches to thinking about health are still kind of repackaged, appropriated, and talked about in a contemporary context too. So one thing that we talked a little bit about earlier in the term that also ties to how we think about health and its relationship to culture is the idea of a placebo, right? So placebo oftentimes is something like a sugar pill. Placebo is used in clinical trials in order to determine whether or not medicine is actually effective, right? The placebo is the inactive treatment. It's the one that's the fake, but it's designed to test the psychological impact versus the actual impact, right? So for instance, to give you one example, if maybe you have a friend and you say, you know what, we're going to go out and get you your first drink, right? And you go to a bar, but unbeknownst to your friend, you have ordered like a non-alcoholic or virgin version of the cocktail, and they drink it, and they don't really know what alcohol tastes like, and they suddenly say, oh yeah, I'm feeling drunk, this is something else, right? And then you tell them, well, it doesn't have alcohol in it. It's an example of a placebo, right? And the interesting thing about a placebo is that we do actually have a psychological reaction to it based on our expectations. We think that we're taking a real medicine or the real thing, and sometimes we actually do feel some type of impact just on the basis of our psychological reaction, or maybe the behavior that we engage in response to the placebo too, right? So placebo has some interesting kind of powerful psychological impacts. And I wanted to share a short video that talks a little bit more about the impact and power of placebo in health and medicine, and the way that we've used that to inform our understanding of health communication.
In 1996, 56 volunteers took part in a study to test a new painkiller called Trivaricane. On each subject, one index finger was covered in the new painkiller, while the other remained untouched. Then, both were squeezed in painful clamps. The subjects reported that the treated finger hurt less than the untreated one. This shouldn't be surprising, except Trivaricane wasn't actually a painkiller, just a fake concoction with no pain-easing properties at all. What made the students so sure this dummy drug had worked? The answer lies in the placebo effect, an unexplained phenomenon wherein drugs, treatments, and therapies that aren't supposed to have an effect and are often fake miraculously make people feel better. Doctors have used the term placebo since the 1700s, when they realized the power of fake drugs to improve people's symptoms. These were administered when proper drugs weren't available, or if someone imagined they were ill. In fact, the word placebo means "I shall please" in Latin, hinting at a history of placating troubled patients. Placebos had to mimic the real treatments in order to be convincing, so they took the form of sugar pills, water-filled injections, and even sham surgeries. Soon, doctors realized that duping people in this way had another use: in clinical trials. By the 1950s, researchers were using placebos as a standard tool to test new treatments. To evaluate a new drug, for instance, half the patients in a trial might receive the real pill. The other half would get a placebo that looked the same. Since patients wouldn't know whether they'd received the real thing or a dud, the results wouldn't be biased, researchers believed. Then, if the new drug showed a significant benefit compared to the placebo, it was proved effective. Nowadays, it's less common to use placebos this way because of ethical concerns. If it's possible to compare a new drug against an older version or another existing drug, that's preferable to simply giving someone no treatment at all, especially if they have a serious ailment. In these cases, placebos are often used as a control to fine-tune the trial so that the effects of the new versus the old or alternative drug can be precisely compared. But of course, we know that placebos exert their own influence too. Thanks to the placebo effect, patients have experienced relief from a range of ailments, including heart problems, asthma, and severe pain, even though all they received was a fake drug or sham surgery. We're still trying to understand how. Some believe that instead of being real, the placebo effect is merely confused with other factors, like patients trying to please doctors by falsely reporting improvements. On the other hand, researchers think that if a person believes a fake treatment is real, their expectations of recovery actually do trigger physiological factors that improve their symptoms. Placebos seem to be capable of causing measurable change in blood pressure, heart rate, and the release of pain-reducing chemicals like endorphins. That explains why subjects in pain studies often say placebos ease their discomfort. Placebos may even reduce levels of stress hormones like adrenaline, which can slow the harmful effects of an ailment. So shouldn't we celebrate the placebo's bizarre benefits? Not necessarily. If somebody believes a fake treatment has cured them, they may miss out on drugs or therapies that are proven to work. Plus, the positive effects may fade over time and often do. Placebos also cloud clinical results, making scientists even more motivated to discover how they wield such power over us. Despite everything we know about the human body, there are still some strange and enduring mysteries, like the placebo effect. So what?
So there are some interesting implications here in thinking about like health and science communication specifically. One of them, as was discussed in the video, is a question surrounding ethics. We talked about Tuskegee syphilis last week, and the idea here is, what are the ethics of saying that you're giving somebody a treatment that's really a placebo? Historically, we've seen that that's been done when there is not access to an alternative that's readily available. Also questions about if you're using it for something like a trial and telling somebody that it's the real thing. That can be one issue. Or providers who issue a placebo knowing that maybe it could have some of those secondary positive impacts like psychological benefits. Or maybe doctors recommend something that doesn't really help, but is a suggestion that the patient thinks that could lead them to feel better. For instance, if they say, sometimes when you feel this, you take a walk in the park, you feel better, right? Issuing those type of recommendations that don't actually have a tangible impact relate kind of closely to ethics. One consideration too is the relationship between a placebo and culture. For instance, if there is like an herb or a medicinal treatment that is important to a culture and important to the idea of health within that culture, but scientifically we know that it doesn't actually have a health benefit, it still carries over the sort of psychological benefits to members of that culture who believe and sort of attribute that treatment as being significant or having a positive impact, right? So there's also, of course, issues on the other end of things that aren't necessarily a placebo, but instead could be actively harmful. For instance, taking a medication that actually is unsafe or unhealthy for you in addressing or dealing with an issue in need of treatment, right? So it brings about some important discussions about ethics and how we communicate that type of relationship between the patient and doctor, and also how we think about culture. Another important element here is this idea of consumerism, right? One way of thinking about consumerism and some of the ways that it impacts health is that oftentimes in the United States, right, we have viewed healthcare under a very consumerism type of lens, that health is a commodity or something that we can purchase and use in order to benefit our care and well-being. Consumerism often comes in terms of reviewing or assessing doctors. For instance, the use of Google reviews or other sites or databases that are designed to essentially assess the performance of doctors. And that can be a useful resource, but it also means that we're oftentimes shopping or thinking about healthcare professional on that basis. And it can also mean that some issues related to health disparities might emerge in the ways that we think about providers as we think about things like gender, race, and so on, right? For instance, I think that there is a more defined cultural stereotype, and it's oftentimes more culturally acceptable for men to be portrayed as more dismissive or disrespectful in doctors, right? You have the Gregory House type characters who are great physicians but don't have a good bedside manner. But oftentimes for women, the more cold or detached style of care is seen more negatively, right? So how we tie and associate providers and treat them under that lens is an important element of care too. So as we think about issues of health and illness, there's a couple things that are important for us to consider. First of all, the idea that patients are partners with you, right? That if you're a provider, you're working together with a patient and you're trying to establish, again, goals under that patient-centric approach. And also to avoid assigning or assuming the cultural beliefs that you have onto patients as well. For instance, if a patient says, I'm not really feeling very good, but I oftentimes feel better if I sit outside in the sun, a provider might think, oh, that's just a placebo that doesn't actually make the person feel better. But maybe engaging with that own person's culture and background means respecting and acknowledging that that might have a positive benefit, or that a placebo brings with it the overall feelings of psychological and social well-being that we talked about earlier. Additionally, another important consideration here are the presence of alternative and complementary medicine, right? So for instance, over the last 2 decades, we've seen a pretty significant rise in alternative styles of medicine or support. And these can be kind of in a whole spectrum, right? For instance, there might be sort of naturopathic or forms of medicine that are actually, that don't have any negative impacts or might even offer some positive impacts or benefits that might not be seen in traditional approaches to medicine, or might be culturally seen as more significant or beneficial, right? They might bring about some benefits or effectiveness that is oftentimes left out of traditional medicine. Holistic medicine, the idea of medicine that supports the entire body, your spiritual, social, mental well-being, has also gained a lot of attention, in part because people have been critical of the idea that a lot of medical interventions, like providers, have been very purely focused on physical health, right? So that the extreme of only focusing on that biomedical approach means that some of the other elements of well-being aren't considered. And so you look for other sources to get there. So while alternative, holistic, and other styles of medicine can be complementary, right, and beneficial to somebody, there's also the other end, right, where sometimes while some interventions might be harmless, there's also risk associated with alternative methods of treatment, right? And we have definitely seen some of those concerns come up in the context of COVID-19, right? And concerns that certain types of treatments or interventions to COVID-19 could directly be harmful. For instance, right, in a lot of the discussion surrounding the use of alternative medication, there have been concerns, for instance, families or children who have consumed like significant amounts of ivermectin and have actually had things like their intestinal lining start to fall apart, are examples of the ways in which those approaches can risk as well. So some of the risks might be related to health. People that could be swindled into buying medication or treatment that does nothing, right? So placebos can be used in a very harmful way. For instance, you know, there are examples of people that will sell something like, you know, say, hey, you should buy these crystals, and if you take them, then your problems will go away, right? Also, one kind of interesting concern is that a lot of the alternative medicines might involve the use of like certain plants or supplements that might be endangered, and the sort of demand for some of these things might actually risk and be a contributing factor in deforestation. For instance, the popularity of like certain like bad foods. For instance, acai got very popular, like in an acai bowl or smoothie or something similar. So that can be a cause of concern. And also if somebody uses alternative or holistic medicine that might interact with something like a medication and doesn't tell a doctor that they're taking it, that can raise a health concern or issue too, right? There's a whole range of discussions surrounding alternative holistic medicine. There are ways in which that treatment can be helpful and can fill in the gaps of care that people don't necessarily get from the other types of medical providers they might work with, but there are also some of the drawbacks and concerns that come with this as well. So it's important to kind of keep that into perspective in terms of its overall contribution to health. So to transition into the last point, and I think we'll just dive right into this so that we can get out a little early and help you to work on your annotated bibliography. I wanted to take some time to talk about and have you explore the Krebs article, right? So one of the articles I'm asking you to read this week, in addition to the chapters, is a piece that's talking about racial disparities in healthcare and helping us to identify the causes and solutions for dealing with some of these issues. One of the kind of shocking statistics that emerged to me over the course of this article is the idea that more than 886,000 deaths of African Americans could have been prevented in that span of time if African American healthcare consumers had received the same quality of care as non-Hispanic white consumers, right? Highlighting how quality of care can make a really significant difference on health. Being able to identify, provide time, provide resources, and support to patients can play a really major role in detection, in providing treatment options, in providing the sort of awareness and training that allows people to receive the support that they need. Also, right, African Americans have both the highest rate of infant mortality and highest incidence of diabetes in the US. And in addition to heart disease, cancer, hypertension, HIV, diabetes, and trauma were significantly large causes of mortality as well, right? Again, getting at the idea that this is not due to biological factors, this is due to the sort of social, socioeconomic, and cultural factors that impact access to and support care, right? So in thinking about health disparities, it's looking at the kind of distance and disproportionate levels of impact. So I want you to return to the teams that you worked with before. And I want you to take some time, if there is a couple members of the group that have access to this week's article, for instance, through a laptop, phone, or other device, just to take some time to do a little bit of searching through the article to find, first of all, we'll have the first group focus on contributing factors to health disparities among African American and other minority patients that are discussed in this piece. And then for the second group, I'll ask the second group to explore, according to this article, what health communication strategies are suggested or recommended to reduce those disparities. So let's have the group here on this side tackle question number one about the contributing factors to health disparities. And let's have the second group here on this side identify some of the health communication strategies. So take some time to explore through the article. You're welcome to look over somebody's shoulder or pull it up on your device. It's linked there on the front page of Canvas. Take some time to explore, come up with what you think addresses that question in the article, and then I'll ask each of the groups to share. Take a bit more time in your groups to share what's standing out to you. Sounds like groups are coming up with some good stuff. take another minute or so to finish up and have somebody ready to share. All right. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that you all noticed from this article. Starting with the first question here on the side, what were some of the contributing factors to health disparities that you all noticed?
Communication within the healthcare system. And that in itself means like unequal access to care and relevant like health information to take care of yourself. And then there are low levels of minority participation in disease prevention, health promotion, and healthcare decision making programs and information. And that's also due to the healthcare system not like encourages participation in those things. And then poor socioeconomic status, low educational attainment levels, racial prejudices within the system. Then there's resistance of African Americans to adopting recommended cancer prevention behaviors. So that includes like cancer screening programs. And then there are inequities in access to the best cancer tests, even if they do try and seek out care, they might not be getting the best health care out there.
Yeah.
And so that's there's significant variation in the access to and delivery of that care, and all kinds of medical things and resources that would help to prevent cancer in the first place or help you fight it. And all of these things kind of boil down to a lack of like good health communication.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of trust, in terms of preventative care, also in terms of like the economic or lifestyle feasibility of implementing some of the recommended things like going in for regular screening and the cost that that can have are definitely really important factors here. How about here on this side? What are some of the things you noticed as strategies?
So a good one was like having more education to like allow the people in those social economic stuff to like stronger and then having a diverse staff within the actual healthcare, making people feel more comfortable while they're easier. And then addressing the digital divide with one because a lot of the people impacted like communication because they don't have access to like and then more frequent health screening, which can be given to them by like targeted health campaigns and target or food. And another one was like healthcare system policies, like the providers are trained to have better.
Right, right. I'm glad you bring that up too, because the sort of practice of cultural training and sensitivity are really important to ensure that professionals are aware. As we've talked about, representation of diversity in staff and expertise means that people are better able to meet and support care on that basis, as well brought up. Using campaigns, including the way that something like an advertisement campaign might include diverse perspectives and representation, like you're watching a TV commercial that advertises the medication, whether or not you see yourself or somebody like you in it might be a deciding factor in whether or not you seek that care or intervention too. So I'm glad both groups pointed these things out because those are some of the crucial ways that we can think about disparities in healthcare. And this article, in addition to highlighting the significance of disparities in healthcare, particularly cancer among African American communities, is also an example of the type of work that you could explore for your presentation, looking at a population that's disproportionately impacted by an issue and the ways that communication can seek to address and repair. Because as Macy brought up in the first group, right, health communication is the big factor that seems to contribute to these disparities. So communication has this powerful role in promoting health. So again, I mentioned let you all get out a little bit early today so that you can have additional time to prepare your in-kid bibliography. I know we kind of rushed through so that we didn't have to do the break. To wrap up for today, we talked about culture in terms of the rules and behavior impacting our interactions with others, the assumptions and challenges related to care, and the importance of issues related to health disparities on care as well. Again, recognizing that disparities are significant and negatively impact our access. Next class, we'll be exploring this issue in greater detail in talking about the use of online communication, including e-health, telehealth, and e-medicine that have gained a lot of traction and significance surrounding COVID-19. So go ahead and pass forward your group work. And then if you had any preference about dates that you completed individually, please pass that forward as well.
We're doing a presentation during class, right?
Yes, during regular class. Just if there's one of those two times that you can't attend.
And I'm down for like the Tuesdays on.
Great. All right. Oh yeah. Thanks, Justice. Hope that was helpful.
Like low income households, like a group that I could look into for like.
Oh yeah.
marginalized?